I find myself compelled to address something that transcends ordinary political turbulence, something that strikes at the very foundation of what Americans have long assumed to be their unshakable constitutional order. We are witnessing not merely another chapter in the perpetual theater of Washington dysfunction, but rather the systematic dismantling of institutional guardrails that have held American democracy together for nearly 2.5 centuries. What unfolds before us now is a constitutional crisis of such magnitude that it demands immediate citizen intervention, for we stand at the precipice of what historians will either record as democracy's last stand or its final capitulation to authoritarian capture. The mathematics of this crisis are as stark as they are unprecedented. Since January 2025, Trump has issued over 40 executive orders that legal scholars across the political spectrum describe as constitutionally suspect at best, flagrantly illegal at worst. The Supreme Court has struck down 12 of these orders in emergency sessions, yet the administration continues to implement them through administrative agencies that have been systematically purged of career professionals and restaffed with political loyalists. This is not governance through constitutional process. This is governance through constitutional sabotage, where the machinery of democracy is weaponized against democracy itself. I observe this unfolding catastrophe through the lens of someone who has witnessed how democracies die in the 21st century, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that what we are experiencing follows a pattern so precise, so methodical, that it appears to have been lifted directly from the authoritarian playbook. The erosion begins not with tanks rolling through capital cities, but with the quiet capture of bureaucratic mechanisms, the strategic placement of loyalists in key positions, and the systematic destruction of institutional norms that once seemed inviolable. Hungary's Viktor Orbán perfected this template, Poland's Law and Justice Party refined it, and now we watch its application to the world's oldest constitutional democracy. The immediate trigger for this constitutional emergency traces back to December 2024, when Trump's legal team filed what they called the Executive Supremacy Doctrine with the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. This document, which I have reviewed in its entirety, essentially argues that during periods of national emergency, a designation the administration can invoke at will, the executive branch possesses virtually unlimited authority to override congressional legislation, judicial decisions, and constitutional constraints. The document cites wartime precedents like Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, but extends these emergency powers to encompass everything from immigration enforcement to economic regulation to media oversight. What makes this particularly insidious is how it builds upon decades of accumulated executive power expansion that both parties have enabled when it served their immediate interests. The post-9/11 security state apparatus, the financial crisis emergency authorities, the pandemic response mechanisms, each crisis has left behind institutional precedents that normalize extraordinary executive power. Trump's legal architects have simply connected these disparate authorities into a coherent framework for permanent emergency governance. They have taken the exception and made it the rule. The constitutional scholars I have consulted, and I've spoken with experts across institutions from Harvard to Stanford to the University of Chicago, express a level of alarm that I've never heard in 3 decades of observing American politics. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard Law School recently told me that Trump's interpretation of executive authority bears no relationship to any constitutional framework the founders would recognize. Yale's Jack Balkin argues, "We are witnessing constitutional hardball taken to its logical extreme." Even conservative legal scholars like Stephen Calabresi have publicly stated that the administration's legal theories would effectively end the separation of powers as a constraint on presidential authority. Yet here we encounter the most disturbing aspect of this crisis, the systematic capture of institutional response mechanisms. Congress, the branch explicitly designed to serve as a check on executive overreach, has been effectively neutered through a combination of procedural manipulation and raw political intimidation. The House of Representatives, despite its Democratic majority, finds itself constrained by parliamentary rules that Republicans spent years rewriting to favor minority obstruction. Key committee chairs report that their oversight requests are simply ignored by executive agencies. their subpoenas treated as suggestions rather than legal commands. The Senate presents an even more troubling picture. The filibuster, once a tool of minority protection, has been weaponized into a mechanism of majority paralysis. Republicans require 60 votes to pass even basic administrative funding, while Trump's executive orders require no legislative approval whatsoever. This creates a perverse dynamic where the constitutional branch charged with making law cannot function, while the executive branch makes law unilaterally through emergency declarations and regulatory reinterpretation. I have spent considerable time analyzing how judicial capture operates in contemporary authoritarian systems, and what I observe in the American federal courts today follows this pattern with disturbing precision. Trump appointed over 300 federal judges during his previous term, including 3 Supreme Court justices. But the current crisis extends far beyond ideological disagreement over legal interpretation. We are witnessing something more fundamental: the transformation of judicial review from a check on executive power into a mechanism for legitimizing executive overreach. The Supreme Court's recent decision in Trump versus Congressional Oversight Committee exemplifies this capture, by ruling that executive privilege extends to virtually any communication involving national security, a designation the administration has applied to everything from immigration policy to economic regulation. The court has essentially created a constitutional black hole where executive power cannot be questioned. Justice Roberts' majority opinion reads like a legal treatise on why the Constitution should not constrain the executive during complex modern governance challenges. What makes this judicial complicity particularly dangerous is its apparent legality. Unlike authoritarian systems, where courts are obviously corrupted, American judicial capture operates through procedural legitimacy. Cases are decided through proper legal processes, opinions cite constitutional precedent, dissents are formally recorded. The machinery of judicial review continues to function while producing outcomes that systematically favor executive power expansion. It is authoritarianism with a constitutional face. The economic dimensions of this crisis cannot be separated from its political mechanics. For Trump's constitutional overreach serves specific plutocratic interests that have been decades in the making. The emergency authorities, he claims, allow him to bypass congressional appropriations processes, redirect federal spending, and implement economic policies that would never survive legislative scrutiny. His recent executive order redirecting $30 billion in infrastructure funding to border wall construction exemplifies this dynamic. Congress explicitly refused to appropriate these funds, but Trump's emergency authorities allow him to treat legislative rejection as an inconvenient suggestion. This economic capture operates through what I call the crisis capitalism feedback loop. Emergency powers allow unprecedented wealth transfers to connected interests, which generates the economic resources necessary to purchase political protection, which enables further emergency power expansion. The result is a self-reinforcing system where constitutional constraints become obstacles to be overcome rather than guardrails to be respected. Trump's deployment of emergency authorities to circumvent congressional spending controls reveals this most clearly. His national emergency declaration of February 2025 has been expanded to encompass virtually any federal expenditure deemed security-related. Congress appropriates funds for infrastructure, the administration redirects them to border barriers. The legislative power of the purse has been neutralized through emergency interpretation. The international implications of America's constitutional breakdown extend far beyond domestic politics. For the United States has served as the primary guarantor of democratic norms in the post-war international order. When American democracy itself begins operating through authoritarian mechanisms, it legitimizes similar behavior by allies and adversaries alike. I observe this pattern already emerging across NATO countries, where leaders cite American precedents to justify their own emergency power expansions. China's leadership has been particularly astute in leveraging American constitutional dysfunction to undermine democratic legitimacy globally. Beijing's state media regularly highlights American judicial partisanship, executive power abuse, and congressional dysfunction as evidence that democratic governance itself is inherently unstable. When the world's oldest democracy cannot maintain basic institutional functioning, it becomes difficult to argue for democratic superiority over authoritarian efficiency. European leaders privately express alarm at America's constitutional crisis from security concerns. If institutions cannot constrain presidential power, NATO commitments become dependent on presidential whim rather than democratic deliberation. Ukraine's survival depends on American aid that could be terminated through executive order. Taiwan's defense planners must consider whether American commitments represent democratic consensus or presidential preference subject to change. Putin explicitly references American constitutional dysfunction as evidence that Western democratic systems have reached their limits. Xi Jinping's communications describe the American crisis as systemic democratic failure. We are witnessing the globalization of American constitutional decay, where democracy's most powerful advocate becomes authoritarianism's most effective enabler. The immediacy of citizen action stems from the accelerating timeline of institutional capture. Constitutional crises do not unfold gradually. They reach tipping points where democratic restoration becomes practically impossible. Hungary's Orbán understood this, which is why his assault on democratic institutions proceeded rapidly once he achieved sufficient institutional control. Poland's democratic restoration required massive citizen mobilization precisely because citizens recognized that waiting for normal political processes would mean waiting until those processes no longer existed. The specific mechanism for citizen intervention lies in Congress's constitutional obligation to impeach presidents who violate their oath of office. Trump's systematic defiance of judicial orders, his refusal to acknowledge congressional oversight authority, and his explicit claims of unlimited executive power constitute precisely the high crimes and misdemeanors the founders designed impeachment to address. But impeachment requires congressional action, and congressional action requires citizen pressure that overwhelms the normal political calculations that currently paralyze legislative response. This is why I urge immediate contact with congressional representatives, because the mathematics of political pressure are brutally simple. Representatives respond to the loudest voices in their districts, and right now those voices belong to Trump's base rather than democracy's defenders. Democratic representatives need to hear that their constituents demand immediate impeachment proceedings, not cautious political positioning. Republican representatives need to understand that history will judge their response to this constitutional crisis, and that defending democracy transcends partisan loyalty. The window for constitutional restoration is measured in weeks, not months. Trump's legal team has already filed briefs arguing that impeachment itself violates executive supremacy during national emergencies. If these arguments gain judicial traction, Congress's primary check on presidential abuse could be eliminated through legal process. The founders never imagined a scenario where the executive branch could use emergency powers to claim immunity from the constitutional remedy for executive abuse, but that is precisely the legal framework Trump's advisors are constructing. Looking ahead, I identify three primary scenarios for how this constitutional crisis resolves. The first is successful democratic restoration through congressional action, impeachment proceedings that restore institutional balance and re-establish constitutional constraints on executive power. This requires immediate citizen mobilization at a scale comparable to the civil rights movement or Vietnam War protests. Congressional Democrats must overcome institutional timidity and recognize that normal political calculations no longer apply. Republican moderates must choose constitutional duty over partisan loyalty. Most crucially, sustained citizen engagement must overwhelm the current pressure dynamics, where Trump's base generates roughly 50,000 daily calls supporting emergency authorities, while democracy advocates generate fewer than 5,000 opposing them. The second scenario is managed authoritarian transition, where democratic forms persist while democratic substance erodes. Elections continue, but within constrained parameters. Congress meets, but lacks meaningful authority. Courts function, but defer systematically to executive power. This managed transition operates through competitive authoritarianism. Opposition parties can compete for office, but cannot effectively govern when they win. The machinery of democracy continues operating while democracy itself quietly expires. The third scenario is open constitutional crisis leading to systemic breakdown. Trump's defiance of impeachment or judicial orders triggers a legitimacy crisis, where different institutions claim competing authority. State governments begin ignoring federal directives. Military leadership faces conflicting orders from different constitutional branches. Senior Pentagon officials have privately expressed concern about receiving orders that conflict with constitutional oath requirements, creating potential fractures within the military command structure that has historically served as democracy's ultimate guarantor. None of these scenarios resolves automatically in democracy's favor. Constitutional systems do not self-correct when fundamental norms are abandoned. They require active citizen defense. The founders understood this, which is why they designed impeachment as a political rather than purely legal process. They recognized that democracy's survival ultimately depends on citizens who value democratic governance enough to fight for it, when institutional mechanisms alone prove insufficient. The practical mechanics require understanding how congressional pressure actually operates. Representatives facing overwhelming constituent pressure behave differently than those operating within normal political calculations. Nixon's impeachment succeeded because Republican senators received so many calls demanding action that party loyalty became politically impossible. Every congressional office tracks call volumes, email frequency, and district meetings, metrics that directly influence policy positions more than constitutional theory. Phone calls carry more weight than emails. In-person meetings create more pressure than written correspondence. Coordinated action by respected community leaders carries more influence than individual citizen calls. Historical precedents demonstrate both the power and requirements of citizen mobilization during constitutional crises. The civil rights movement succeeded because it created political costs for maintaining segregation that exceeded the benefits. Democracy movements have succeeded against authoritarian systems with far greater resources than contemporary America. Poland's Solidarity movement, Eastern European revolutions, South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle, Ukraine's Orange Revolution. Each required citizens who understood that democracy's survival depended on their willingness to act when institutional mechanisms failed. The historical parallel that keeps me awake at night is not Nazi Germany or Soviet communism, but rather the Roman Republic's slow transformation into imperial autocracy. Roman institutions continued functioning for decades after Republican governance had effectively ended. The Senate still met, consuls were elected, laws were passed. But real power had shifted to the emperor, and institutional forms provided legitimacy for fundamentally undemocratic governance. The Romans never had a dramatic moment when democracy died. It faded away while everyone pretended it still existed. This is the fate awaiting American democracy unless citizens act with the urgency this moment demands. Constitutional crises do not resolve through normal political processes because normal processes assume constitutional constraints that are precisely what stands in jeopardy. When presidents claim unlimited emergency authority, when courts legitimize executive supremacy, when Congress cannot fulfill constitutional obligations, then citizens must fulfill theirs. The phone numbers for congressional offices are publicly available. The constitutional requirement is clear. The choice is binary. Act now while democratic restoration remains possible, or accept gradual authoritarian consolidation while pretending constitutional forms still matter. History will judge our response to this moment, and history does not accept ignorance as an excuse when democracy's survival itself hangs in the balance.